In the arenas of the outer systems, mercy was considered a defect. The transport descended through a ceiling of rust-colored clouds, its engines humming with the steady vibration of old military hardware. Ethan Carter stood inside the containment bay with magnetic cuffs locked around his wrists, the cold metal resting against his skin like a quiet reminder that the war was over for him, even if the universe had not yet decided what to do with the survivors. Through the narrow observation slit he could see the planet below, an endless desert broken by black stone ridges and the skeletons of ancient structures that looked far older than humanity's first rockets. Draction 9, the guards had called it. A testing world. A place where empires proved their warriors. The deck shuddered as landing clamps engaged, and a deep mechanical hiss rolled through the bay while the rear hatch began to open. Hot air poured in immediately, thick with dust and the faint metallic scent of machinery that had been running far too long. Two alien guards stepped forward, tall figures wrapped in silver combat armor that reflected the pale light of the arena outside. Their movements were efficient and silent. Ethan had learned quickly that most alien soldiers didn't waste words. One of them tapped a control pad and the magnetic cuffs released from the wall track, forcing Ethan forward. Chains of blue light formed between the cuffs, guiding him toward the ramp whether he wanted to walk or not. The moment he stepped outside, the scale of the place hit him. The arena stretched nearly half a mile across, a vast circle of dark stone surrounded by towering platforms where thousands of alien spectators watched in still silence. No shouting. No cheering. Just observation. Like scientists waiting for an experiment to begin. Ethan squinted against the harsh sunlight. Back on Earth, he had trained in deserts that reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit by noon. This place felt hotter. The sand shimmered like molten glass beneath his boots. He had the sudden, strange thought that somewhere in the galaxy someone had decided a captured human soldier was useful for something other than prison. He didn't know whether to be grateful or worried. At the center of the arena stood a tall structure made of black metal arches that hummed with faint electrical pulses. Symbols carved into the surface glowed with pale blue light, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. Ethan didn't need a translator to understand what it was. Some kind of machine. Something ceremonial. Something important enough that the entire crowd had gathered to watch. The guard stopped 20 feet away and forced him to his knees. The sand burned through the fabric of his uniform instantly. He ignored it. A lifetime in the Marines had taught him that pain was just information. Useful, but rarely urgent. What mattered was the movement above. A section of the spectator platform opened with a slow mechanical rumble, and a single figure descended on a narrow lift platform. At first Ethan thought it was a statue. The armor looked too precise, too symmetrical to belong to a living being. But then the figure moved. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Blue skin reflecting the desert light. A warrior. She stepped off the platform with quiet confidence, her armored boots barely disturbing the sand as she walked toward him. The crowd remained silent. Ethan slowly lifted his head to meet her eyes. They were bright, almost silver, studying him with the calm focus of someone evaluating a tool. Or perhaps a problem. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then a voice echoed through the arena from hidden speakers, translated into English with mechanical precision. Subject Ethan Carter of Earth. You have been selected for the war bond trial. Ethan blinked once. War bond. The alien warrior stopped directly in front of him. Up close she was easily 7 feet tall, her armor etched with symbols that looked ancient even to a human who had never seen alien writing before. She looked down at him, expression unreadable. The voice continued. If the bond succeeds, both will fight as one. The air grew strangely quiet. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten as the voice finished its explanation. If the bond fails, both will perish. The alien warrior's gaze hardened slightly. For the first time, Ethan realized something unexpected. She wasn't pleased about this either. The heat of the arena settled over Ethan Carter like a heavy blanket while the alien warrior studied him in silence, her silver eyes reflecting the pale glow of the machine behind them. The air vibrated with a low mechanical hum that seemed to rise from the black metal arches at the center of the arena, each pulse steady and deliberate as though the device itself were waiting. Ethan slowly pushed himself up from his knees, the sand sliding off his uniform as he stood. No guard stopped him. Apparently the experiment required him to be conscious and cooperative, or at least standing. The towering alien woman remained only a few feet away, easily a foot taller than any soldier Ethan had ever served beside. Blue skin caught the sunlight beneath the edges of her armor, smooth and unscarred, while the plates covering her shoulders carried markings that looked ceremonial rather than purely military. Ethan had learned enough during his captivity to recognize rank when he saw it. This was not a common soldier. The voice that had spoken before returned, calm and distant, as if the entire arena were merely another laboratory. The translation echoed through hidden speakers with perfect clarity. Warrior Kael Vara of the Terran Dominion. Step forward. The alien woman moved without hesitation. Each step was controlled, deliberate, as though every motion had been practiced 1,000 times before. When she reached the machine, the blue symbols carved into the metal arches brightened slightly, responding to her presence. Ethan noticed something else as well. Her posture was rigid, but not eager. If anything, there was a faint tension in the way her shoulders held steady. She was not here by choice. That realization settled quietly into Ethan's mind. The voice continued. Human subject Ethan Carter. Approach the bond frame. Ethan exhaled slowly and walked forward. The chains of blue light between his cuffs guided him toward the center platform where Kael Vara now stood waiting. Up close the machine was taller than he had expected, nearly 12 feet high, shaped like a circular gateway with thin metallic arms extending inward toward a central point. Thin lines of energy moved along its surface like flowing water. Ethan had seen advanced alien technology before, but this device carried a different feeling. It was not simply equipment. It was ritual. He stopped on the marked circle opposite the alien warrior. For the first time their eyes met directly without distance between them. Up close her gaze was sharper than he expected, analytical and calm. Not hatred. Not anger. Something closer to evaluation. As though she were trying to understand what kind of creature he was. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Let me guess, he said quietly, knowing the translators would carry his words. You did not volunteer either. The alien warrior did not answer immediately. For several seconds she simply studied him. Then her voice came, deep and clear, the translator adjusting the tone into smooth English. Humans speak too easily in the presence of uncertainty. Ethan gave a faint smile. We call it optimism. Her expression did not change, but something subtle passed across her eyes. Perhaps curiosity. The arena lights dimmed slightly as the machine activated. A ring of pale energy formed between the metal arches, slowly rotating with a sound like distant thunder. The voice returned again. The war bond trial will now begin. Neural synchronization will commence in 10 seconds. Ethan felt the metal cuffs tighten automatically. Thin strands of glowing light extended from the machine toward both of them, hovering in the air like threads waiting to connect. He looked at the alien warrior one more time. If this thing links our minds, he said quietly, we should probably start with names. A brief pause followed. Then the alien warrior spoke. Kael Vara. Ethan nodded once. Ethan Carter. The energy threads brightened. The machine pulsed. And somewhere above them, thousands of silent spectators watched as two strangers from different worlds prepared to share the same mind. The machine awakened with a deep resonant hum that rolled across the arena like distant thunder while the glowing threads of energy finally moved. They drifted through the air with slow deliberate precision until they touched Ethan Carter and Kael Vara at the same time. The moment contact happened the entire structure pulsed with blue light. Ethan felt the sensation instantly. It was not pain. It was pressure. A strange expanding awareness spreading behind his eyes as if a door inside his mind had opened without asking permission. For a second the desert vanished. The heat vanished. Even the sound of the crowd faded into something distant and hollow. Images rushed forward like reflections in moving water. Ethan saw towering stone cities beneath alien stars. He saw training grounds built from black metal where rows of warriors moved in perfect discipline. He felt the weight of armor heavier than anything on earth and the sharp pride that came with wearing it. None of those memories belonged to him. He understood that immediately. They belonged to her. Kael'vara stood motionless inside the ring of energy while the bond frame glowed brighter around them. She felt it too. Ethan could sense the sudden tension ripple through her thoughts like a blade drawn from its sheath. A human mind was not something her people expected to share space with. Confusion moved through the connection first. Then caution. Ethan inhaled slowly, trying to stay calm while the unfamiliar sensations passed through him. He had trained for battlefield stress his entire life, but nothing in Marine survival school had prepared him for standing inside another person's memories. The machine continued its quiet work. Thin arcs of light circled both of them, weaving together like threads forming a single rope. The voice of the arena returned again, steady and emotionless. Neural synchronization at 30%. Maintain cognitive stability. Ethan almost laughed at that. Cognitive stability was a generous expectation under the circumstances. He shifted his weight slightly in the sand and glanced at Kael'vara. Her posture had changed just enough for him to notice. Her shoulders were still square but her gaze had sharpened, studying him with new intensity. She could see something too. He felt the moment her awareness brushed against his memories. A flash of green forests under rain clouds. A small house in the Midwest where wind chimes hung beside a wooden porch. The smell of fresh coffee drifting through a quiet kitchen early in the morning. For a brief instant the alien warrior experienced Earth through Ethan's mind. The reaction was immediate. Surprise flickered through the bond like a spark across a wire. Ethan felt it clearly. She had expected something else. Perhaps chaos. Perhaps aggression. Instead she found ordinary human life. The bond deepened another level. Neural synchronization at 50%. The energy ring brightened overhead while the machine's humming tone dropped into a slower rhythm. Ethan suddenly felt Kael'vara's focus lock onto something inside his thoughts. A memory from years earlier. A marine training ground under a wide blue sky. Young recruits running through sand while instructors shouted orders across the field. Ethan felt embarrassment ripple through the connection. He had not planned on sharing his worst training day with an alien warrior. Kael'vara responded with something unexpected. Amusement. The emotion appeared quickly and vanished just as fast, but the bond had already carried it across. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Did you just laugh at my boot camp memories?" he asked quietly. The alien warrior looked at him directly. For the first time since they met her expression changed in the smallest possible way. "Your species trains its soldiers with remarkable inefficiency," she replied calmly. Ethan smiled despite the situation. "Yeah," he said softly. "But we usually survive it." Above them the machine pulsed once more as the bond climbed higher and the invisible bridge between their minds grew stronger. The energy ring above them dimmed slowly as the machine completed its final pulse and the invisible pressure inside Ethan Carter's mind settled into something steadier, like the quiet hum of a generator that would never fully shut down again. For a moment neither of them moved. The bond frame powered down piece by piece, the glowing symbols fading until only the desert sunlight remained. Ethan blinked several times, adjusting to the sudden silence. The arena felt different now. Larger somehow, but also clearer. He could still feel the presence of Kael'vara in the back of his awareness, not as a voice but as a faint emotional current moving beside his own thoughts. Calm. Focused. Watchful. It was not intrusive. It was simply there. The mechanical voice returned overhead, carrying across the stone walls with the same distant neutrality. Neural synchronization complete. War bond established. The arena floor beneath them vibrated as the metal arches separated and lowered into the ground, leaving only the two of them standing at the center of the massive circle of sand. Ethan rubbed his wrists as the magnetic cuffs released with a quiet click. He had expected guards to rush in immediately. None did. Instead, the massive gates on the far side of the arena began to open with a grinding metallic echo that rolled across the desert air. Sunlight poured through the widening gap, revealing the endless wasteland beyond the arena walls. Ethan turned toward the opening and felt a ripple move through the bond between them. Kael Vara had already recognized what it meant. This was not the end of the trial. It was the beginning. The voice confirmed it a moment later. War bond participants will now enter the survival field. Duration of trial, 7 planetary days. Ethan let out a slow breath and looked back at the alien warrior beside him. She was watching the opening gate with steady focus, her posture straight and balanced like someone preparing for a long march rather than a battle. The wind pushed warm desert air across the arena floor, carrying grains of sand that brushed against Ethan's boots. He had spent enough time in hostile environments to understand the situation immediately. The arena had only been a demonstration. Whatever waited beyond those gates was the real test. Ethan glanced sideways at Kael Vara. 7 days, he said quietly. That is about 168 hours if your empire measures time the same way. Her silver eyes shifted toward him. Our measurement is similar, she replied. Her voice remained calm, but the bond carried something deeper beneath the words. Determination. Focus sharpened by years of training. Ethan nodded once. Good, he said. Then we both know how long we need to stay alive. The giant gates finally locked into their fully open position with a deep metallic thud. Beyond them stretched miles of cracked desert terrain scattered with black stone ridges and distant dunes that shimmered under the intense heat. The temperature had to be well over 110 degrees Fahrenheit already, and the sun was still climbing. Ethan adjusted the collar of his uniform and stepped forward. No guards stopped him. No chains held him back. For the first time since his capture he was walking under an open sky again. Kael Vara moved beside him with quiet precision, her armored boots leaving sharp prints in the sand. As they crossed the boundary of the arena together, Ethan felt the bond between them shift slightly, like two instruments adjusting to the same rhythm. Two strangers. Two species that had met as enemies only minutes earlier. Now linked by something neither of them had chosen. Ethan looked out across the endless desert and allowed himself a small smile. Well, he said under his breath. Looks like we are partners now. Beside him Kael Vara did not smile, but the faint current of thought passing through the bond carried something very close to agreement. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the arena walls, a wide ocean of amber sand broken by jagged black ridges that rose like the bones of an ancient world. Ethan Carter walked slowly at first, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness while the heat pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible weight. The air smelled dry and metallic, the kind of air that pulled moisture from your lungs with every breath. Back on Earth he had trained in Arizona during summer drills where the temperature climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit by noon. This place felt worse. The sky above Draction 9 carried a pale yellow sun that burned brighter than anything he remembered from home. Sweat formed along the back of his neck almost immediately. Beside him Kael Vara moved with quiet efficiency, her long stride steady and controlled. Her armor reflected the sunlight in dull blue patterns, and the faint hum of its internal systems carried across the bond between them like the distant vibration of an engine. Ethan could feel her awareness moving across the terrain, measuring distance, scanning the horizon, calculating paths through the desert. She was not wandering. She was mapping. He found that strangely reassuring. The war bond connection between them had settled into a low steady presence, like a second heartbeat somewhere just behind his thoughts. When Kael'Vara focused on something he felt a faint echo of her attention. When Ethan noticed movement in the distance the signal flowed back the other direction. Neither of them had to speak for the information to pass between them. After nearly half a mile of walking Ethan spotted the first sign that the trial environment was not entirely natural. A narrow line of metal poles stood half buried in the sand about 200 yards ahead. Each pole carried a small circular device that blinked with a soft green light. Surveillance markers. The Empire wanted to watch every step of this experiment. Ethan pointed toward them. Observation posts, he said quietly. Looks like your people want front row seats. Kael'Vara followed his gesture without breaking stride. The bond carried a brief wave of recognition. Monitoring beacons, she confirmed. They record environmental data and participant performance. Ethan chuckled under his breath. In other words, they want to see if we survive. Kael'Vara did not answer immediately. Her attention shifted across the horizon where a darker band of terrain rose in the distance. Ethan felt the change in her focus through the bond. Something ahead had caught her attention. The ground beneath their feet gradually changed from loose sand to cracked stone, forming a rough plateau that stretched nearly half a mile wide. The air cooled slightly as a faint wind drifted across the higher ground. Ethan welcomed the breeze even though it carried more dust with it. He climbed the ridge beside Kael'Vara and looked down into the valley on the other side. What he saw made him pause. A shallow basin spread below them, dotted with clusters of strange metallic structures that looked partially buried by decades of shifting sand. Some of them were towers no more than 20 feet tall. Others were little more than broken frames sticking out of the ground at odd angles. Old installations. Abandoned equipment. Maybe remnants from earlier trials. Ethan crouched slightly and rested his hands on his knees while studying the valley. Looks like someone tried building a station out here a long time ago, he said. Through the bond he felt Kael'Vara analyze the same landscape with precise calculation. Her awareness traced the shadows between the structures, measuring wind direction and temperature changes the way a hunter studied tracks in the dirt. It may provide shelter, she said calmly. Ethan nodded. Shelter meant shade. Shade meant survival in this kind of heat. He stood again and adjusted the strap of the small supply pack that the trial organizers had apparently decided to leave him with. One canteen. One basic survival kit. Not generous, but enough to start. He looked at the alien warrior beside him and gave a small shrug. Well, partner, he said quietly. Looks like we found our first campsite. Kael'Vara turned toward the valley and began walking down the slope without hesitation. The faint emotional signal moving through the bond carried something new now. Not suspicion. Not curiosity. Purpose. And Ethan followed her into the ruins as the desert sun climbed higher above the silent world. The ruins offered shade but not comfort. Ethan Carter stepped carefully between half-buried metal beams while the wind whispered through the broken structures like air moving through an old ship hull. The temperature dropped slightly under the leaning towers, enough that the sun no longer pressed directly against his shoulders. After the long walk across the open desert it felt almost luxurious. He removed the canteen from his pack and took a slow measured drink, careful not to waste a single drop. The water was warm but it still felt like life returning to his body. He handed the canteen toward Kael'Vara out of habit before remembering she might not need it. She looked at the container for a moment, then shook her head slightly. My armor regulates hydration through internal reserves, she said calmly. Ethan nodded and capped the canteen again. Must be nice. The alien warrior stepped deeper into the ruins, her silver eyes scanning every angle of the broken structures. Through the bond Ethan felt the steady rhythm of her attention moving across the environment. She was cataloging everything. Structural strength. Wind direction. Escape paths. It reminded him of how Marine scouts evaluated terrain before setting up an observation post. The connection between their minds carried more than information now. It carried understanding. Not complete understanding, but enough that Ethan could recognize the method behind her thinking. He followed her between two tilted towers that leaned together like giant rusted ribs. The ground beneath them had hardened into dark stone, scattered with fragments of old machinery that had long since lost their purpose. A faint electronic chirp echoed from somewhere overhead. Ethan glanced up and spotted a small surveillance drone floating silently near the top of one of the towers. It hovered there like a mechanical bird, its lenses adjusting as it tracked their movement. "Your empire really does not like missing data," Ethan muttered. Kale Vara did not look up at the drone. "The war bond trial has existed for centuries," she replied. "Every attempt is recorded." Ethan walked another few steps and rested his hand against a slanted metal panel that still held a little coolness from the night before. "Attempt," he repeated quietly. Interesting choice of word. Through the bond he felt a brief flicker of something from Kale Vara. Not quite regret. Something closer to memory. The sensation passed quickly, but Ethan noticed it. He studied the alien warrior as she moved toward a larger structure at the center of the ruins. This one still had most of its walls intact, forming a wide circular shelter with a partial roof that blocked nearly all the sunlight. It looked like the remains of an old monitoring station. Inside, the air felt several degrees cooler. Ethan stepped in behind her and let out a long breath. "Now this," he said, glancing around the shadowed interior, "is the best real estate we have seen all day." Kale Vara stopped near the center of the chamber and rested one hand against a metal pillar. The bond carried her quiet assessment of the structure. Stable. Elevated. Defensible. Ethan recognized the conclusion forming in her thoughts. Before she even spoke. "We remain here until nightfall," she said. Ethan dropped his pack beside one of the walls and sat down on the cool stone floor, stretching his legs out with relief. The silence that followed felt different from the tension of earlier hours. Outside, the wind continued to move across the valley, stirring the sand in slow waves. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Yet the bond between them carried small pieces of awareness back and forth like quiet signals. Ethan sensed Kale Vara examining the horizon through one of the broken windows. She sensed him calculating how much water remained in the canteen. Two separate minds working on the same problem without argument. After a while Ethan leaned his head back against the metal wall and glanced toward the alien warrior. "You know," he said softly, "for two people who met about 3 hours ago under very strange circumstances, we are starting to work like a decent team." Kale Vara did not answer immediately. She continued watching the desert beyond the ruins. But through the bond Ethan felt a faint shift in her thoughts. Not agreement exactly. Something quieter than that. Something close to trust beginning its first fragile step. The sun moved slowly across the sky while the ruins remained quiet, their rusted walls casting long shadows across the stone floor. Ethan Carter sat near the edge of the broken chamber with his back against the metal wall, watching the light shift through the fractured openings above. The desert heat had begun to ease slightly as the afternoon stretched toward evening. Even so, the air still carried a dry weight that pulled moisture from every breath. He lifted the canteen again, taking another careful sip before sealing it tightly and placing it back inside the pack. Every drop mattered out here. Across the chamber Kale Vara remained standing near the opening that faced the valley. Her tall silhouette cut sharply against the golden light outside, motionless except for the slow movements of her head as she scanned the horizon. Through the bond Ethan could feel the steady pattern of her focus, like a radar sweeping the landscape in quiet circles. It was oddly comforting. After years in the military he understood the value of someone who never stopped paying attention. The wind shifted direction suddenly, carrying a faint ripple through the sand outside. Ethan felt it first through the bond before he heard it with his ears. Kale Vara had already noticed. Her attention sharpened instantly, the calm rhythm inside the connection tightening into something more alert. Ethan stood and walked over beside her, following the direction of her gaze. At first he saw nothing except the rolling dunes and scattered black ridges stretching miles across the desert. Then the sand moved again. Not like wind this time. Something beneath the surface shifted slowly, leaving a faint curved trail that crossed the valley floor nearly 300 yards away. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Tell me that is just the wind," he said quietly. Kael'vara watched the movement for several seconds without answering. Her mind worked through possibilities with precise discipline. Ethan felt the calculations ripple across the bond as she measured distance, speed, and direction. Finally she spoke. "It is alive." The words carried no fear, only certainty. Ethan folded his arms and studied the distant trail again. Whatever moved out there remained mostly hidden beneath the sand, surfacing only long enough to shift the desert surface before vanishing again. The motion was slow but purposeful. Something large enough to disturb the entire valley floor. "Good news," Ethan said calmly. "It has not noticed us yet." Kael'vara nodded once. The ruins provide concealment. They remained standing in silence while the creature's distant path gradually curved away from the valley and disappeared behind the far ridge. The sand settled again as though nothing had passed through it at all. Ethan released a breath he had not realized he was holding. The bond between them loosened slightly as the tension faded. He glanced sideways at the alien warrior. "Well," he said softly, "that answers one question." Kael'vara turned her silver eyes toward him. "Which question?" Ethan gave a small shrug. Whether this trial was going to be boring. For a brief moment the bond carried a faint echo of something unusual from Kael'vara. Not amusement exactly, but close enough that Ethan recognized the shift. She looked back toward the darkening sky as the first hints of evening began to touch the desert horizon. "Night will lower the temperature," she said. "It will also change what moves across the desert." Ethan followed her gaze toward the fading sunlight. The sky had begun turning shades of amber and violet as the long day finally started to end. Somewhere out beyond the dunes, hidden beneath the sand, the enormous creature continued its slow journey through the desert. Ethan rested his hands on the edge of the broken wall and allowed himself a quiet smile. "Good," he said. Because surviving 168 hours would be too easy without a few surprises. And beside him Kael'vara remained watchful as the first stars of an unfamiliar galaxy slowly appeared above the silent world. The desert night arrived quickly once the sun disappeared behind the distant black ridges, and the temperature dropped almost 30 degrees within an hour. Ethan Carter stood near the broken window of the ruined station and watched the last trace of daylight fade from the horizon. The sky above Draction 9 revealed itself slowly, layer by layer, until an ocean of unfamiliar stars filled the darkness. Some were bright white points like the ones he remembered from Earth. Others burned with faint blue or violet light, scattered across the galaxy like distant lanterns. For a moment Ethan simply stood there, breathing the cooler air and letting the silence settle around the ruins. The desert had changed. During the day the wind had carried heat and dust. At night it moved more gently, whispering across the sand in long steady waves. Behind him Kael'vara adjusted her position near the center of the chamber, her armor releasing a soft mechanical tone as it shifted into a lower power state. The bond between them carried the same alert focus as before, but it felt steadier now, like two watchmen sharing the same quiet shift. Ethan stepped away from the window and crouched near his pack, removing the small survival light from the kit. He activated it at the lowest possible setting, creating a faint circle of pale illumination across the stone floor. "We will need a plan for water," he said quietly while examining the remaining supplies. "This canteen will not last 7 days." Kael'vara approached slowly and studied the equipment with calm attention. Through the bond Ethan felt her mind measuring possibilities the same way she had studied the terrain earlier. "The ruins were once a research outpost," she said. "Where there is research equipment there may have been atmospheric collectors." Ethan looked up. "Machines that pull moisture from the air." She nodded once. "Primitive versions exist on many frontier worlds." Ethan leaned back slightly and glanced toward the darker hallways that extended deeper into the ruins beyond the chamber. Most of the interior structures were buried under decades of sand and dust, but some sections still stood. "Then we should search before the night gets colder," he said. They moved together into the interior passageways, their steps echoing softly against the old metal walls. The faint glow from Ethan's survival light revealed corridors lined with broken consoles and collapsed panels that looked as though they had not been touched in decades. Dust coated every surface. Some of the old equipment still carried faint energy signatures that flickered occasionally like dying embers. Ethan brushed sand away from one console and tapped the cracked screen. Nothing responded. "This place has been abandoned a long time," he said. Kael'Vara moved farther down the corridor, her eyes reflecting the small light as she scanned the structure with steady precision. Through the bond Ethan felt a sudden shift in her attention. She had found something. He walked quickly to join her at the far end of the hallway where a tall cylindrical device stood partially buried against the wall. Its outer shell was scratched and worn, but several small panels still glowed with weak green light. Ethan raised his eyebrows. "Well, I will be," he murmured. Kael'Vara placed one hand on the side of the machine and studied the control interface. "Atmospheric condenser," she confirmed. Ethan felt a surge of cautious hope rise through the bond between them. Water meant survival. He crouched beside the device while examining the pipes that ran along its base. "If we can get this thing working again," he said slowly, "our odds just improved." The old machine hummed faintly as if responding to their presence, a relic from a forgotten outpost that might still have one useful purpose left. Above them the stars continued to spread across the night sky while deep beneath the desert sand the unseen creature moved through the darkness somewhere far beyond the ruins. Morning arrived quietly over the desert of Draction 9, the first pale light spreading across the horizon like a slow breath returning to the world. Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the ruined outpost and watched the sunrise paint the endless dunes in shades of copper and gold. The night had passed without disturbance, and the ancient atmospheric condenser now hummed steadily behind him, producing a small but precious trickle of water that dripped into a metal container below the unit. It was not much, but it was enough. Enough to keep two unlikely survivors alive on a forgotten world. Ethan lifted the container and examined the clear liquid gathering inside. "I have seen worse survival plans," he said quietly. Kael'Vara stood several feet away near the broken wall of the outpost, her tall figure illuminated by the rising sun. The light reflected across the silver lines of her armor while the desert wind moved softly across the sand around them. Through the bond Ethan felt her calm awareness stretching outward across the valley. Something had changed during the night. Not danger exactly, but movement. Far above the desert floor a faint shimmer appeared in the sky, almost invisible against the morning light. Ethan noticed it a moment later and shaded his eyes. At first he thought it might be a distant starship passing through orbit, but the shimmer grew brighter as it descended slowly through the atmosphere. A low vibration spread across the air, gentle but unmistakable. Kael'Vara turned her gaze toward the sky. Recognition moved through the bond like a quiet wave. "Observation vessel," she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. The trial was over. High above them a sleek silver craft emerged fully from the upper clouds and began descending toward the ruins in a controlled spiral. The ship was enormous compared to the broken outpost, its smooth structure reflecting the morning sunlight like polished glass. As it lowered closer to the surface the engines shifted into a softer resonance that stirred the sand across the valley floor. Ethan rested his hands on the edge of the wall and watched the craft settle several hundred yards away on a flat section of desert. A moment later a ramp extended from the underside of the vessel and several tall figures stepped into the sunlight. They moved with the same disciplined posture Kael'Vara carried, their armor bearing the insignia of the same alien command structure. Ethan glanced toward her. "Your people," he said. She did not move immediately. For a long moment Kael'Vara simply looked across the desert toward the arriving warriors, her thoughts flowing clearly through the bond. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment in her mind. The trial had not only tested survival. It had tested judgment, loyalty, honor. Finally she stepped forward. Together they walked out from the shadow of the ruins and into the open desert as the alien warriors approached. The wind moved gently across the sand between them while the rising sun brightened the sky overhead. When the first of the alien officers reached them he stopped and studied the scene carefully. His gaze moved from Kale Vara to Ethan Carter and then to the old atmospheric condenser still humming quietly behind them. For several seconds no one spoke. Then the officer inclined his head slightly toward Kale Vara. "The bond trial is complete," he said in a calm measured tone. "Report your conclusion." Kale Vara stood tall beside the human prisoner who was no longer truly a prisoner at all. The bond between them remained steady, clear, undeniable. Her voice carried across the quiet desert air. "The human is worthy." The officer's eyes shifted toward Ethan once more, studying him with a new kind of curiosity. Ethan gave a small tired smile and shrugged lightly beneath the desert sun. He was not a hero. Not a warrior from legend. Just a man who